Well, good morning. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers, Mona, Anna, for the invitation. It's an enormous pleasure for me to be here with you, discussing such important and urgent, actually, issues regarding this link between property and planning. And what I brought for you to consider is the Brazilian experience, mostly from a legal viewpoint. As you may know, Brazil approved a new legal framework back in 2001, which is called the City Statute. But now we have enough evidence, enough elements to assess what has happened to this new framework, to this new legal paradigm. And basically, there is a broader context there. I mean, there is this growing understanding that to a significant extent, the pattern of sociospatial segregation and informality that we see in cities everywhere has resulted not only from political reasons, economic factors, but also from the nature of the legal system, from the exclusionary nature, from the elitist nature of the legal system in force in so many countries. I mean, so more than ever, we understand that informality results from the legal order. The law has produced informality in many direct ways. So because of this growing realization, there is this corresponding movement of people, policymakers, urban managers asking, so how can we make the legal system a factor of social-spatial inclusion and not only a factor of segregation, a factor of exclusion? So you have this understanding in many contexts that urban reform to promote social-spatial inclusion can only happen if it is supported at the same time by a process of legal reform. Legal reform and urban reform should walk hand in hand, having the same kind of objectives. So because of that, in many countries internationally, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, there is this growing movement for the formulation, discussion, and approval of a whole new range of laws. Urban laws, land laws, planning laws, territorial laws. They have been discussed, they have been enacted, and on the part of international and national organizations, World Bank, UN Habitat, also there's this growing investment towards promoting legal reform so as to create more inclusive legal systems in order to promote urban reform. So what can be expected, you see, of this new generation of laws? Urban planning laws, urban policy laws, land laws. What does it take for these new laws to be fully enforced and to be fully effective? And above all, what are the nature, possibilities, and constraints of more progressive laws vis-à-vis the broader social-political process, which is essentially one of exclusion, segregation, and peripherization of the poor. So the City Statute in Brazil is a very, very good case study for us to discuss all these questions, because it's Brazil's national urban policy law approved back in 2001, regulating the chapter on urban policy, which had been approved before in 1988 by the Constitution in Brazil, which means that it took 12 years of very intense disputes inside and outside of the National Congress for this new legal framework to be approved in Brazil. And it was largely the result of intense social political mobilization processes in Brazil, led by the National Forum of Urban Reform in Brazil. Ever since it has gained international acclaim, I mean, this new law has been recognized as perhaps the most adequate legal paradigm conducive to providing legal support to governmental and social attempts at promoting urban reform. United Nations Habitat has all the time, stressed the importance of this legal framework. The Cities Alliance has been promoting it internationally as a model or some kind of paradigm to be obeyed and observed by countries everywhere. So the question is it really that important? Does it deserve all this growing international acclaim? And I do believe that it does, in that it it has created a new, completely groundbreaking, I'd say, urban land governance framework. In the first dimension of this law, it has replaced this traditional unqualified concept of property rights, which was discussed here a while ago, with a much broader notion of the social function of property, both private and public property, to support the democratization of the access to urban land and housing. More than that, there's a second dimension in the law articulating land, urban policy, and housing policy, which is new because traditionally these are fields treated through different laws in a highly fragmented way. More than that, there's a third dimension in this law in which legal rights and urban policy principles were translated into mechanisms, processes, instruments, and resources in order to make urban management viable. So this concern with management is very much one of the features of this law. And finally, there is another dimension which is unheard of in most similar kind of legal frameworks, which is this determination of the obligation of the public authorities to capture back for the community the gigantic surplus value that has been generated by state action through works, services, as well as urban legislation, but which has been traditionally appropriated by landowners, by property owners. So how to get back for the community this surplus value generated by the community, by the state, but appropriated by the few. So more than that, the law has also a dimension of governance in that it has created a whole much more dynamic system of decentralized and democratized urban governance, emphasizing intergovernmental articulation, partnerships between the state sector with the private sector, the community sector, the voluntary sector. Popular participation in decision-making and law-making has been viewed not only as a criterion of sociopolitical legitimacy, but a criterion of legal validity of plans, policies, and laws. And more than that, all those millions of Brazilians living in informal settlements have been recognized as subjects of rights, meaning that there is a collective right to the regularization of consolidated informal settlements, which we call mostly favelas in Brazil. So basically, for all its many, many shortcomings, the city statute is a groundbreaking law. It does provide a new legal paradigm. But the fact is that Brazil is highly decentralized. It's said to be perhaps the most decentralized country today, meaning that municipalities have an enormous amount of political, legal, and financial power. So, this means that ultimately the principles of the city statute have to be materialized at the local level through the action of the municipalities. And about 1,700 municipalities in Brazil had the legal obligation to formulate municipal master plans in order to materialize the principles of the city statute in their own local orders and realities. And so far, about 1,450 municipalities have already done so. I think that in itself is remarkable. Never before in the past did we see so many municipalities confronting their own local processes of urban development, housing, transportation, and land delivery, and all that. So there has been this intense process of lawmaking, policymaking at the local level. But these have been very turbulent times for cities in Brazil. Since the city statute was approved 10 years ago or more, 15 years ago, cities have become something else in Brazil. They are no longer merely the place where economic production takes place. In a context of post-industrial capitalism in Brazil, cities have also become the object of economic production, meaning that never before the levels of land, property, and rental appreciation and speculation were so high. They've been breaking historical records. Brazil is now #1 on the international ranking of property appreciation. So there's this gigantic pressure for development, construction, and all that. I mean, the rates of informal development remain high. The number of forced evictions is staggering, even in cities where historically you could see attempts at promoting social spatial inclusion, urban reform. There is a widespread crisis in service provision and infrastructure. And as you may know, since May 2003, almost on a daily basis, thousands of Brazilians are taken to the streets to protest. You have social mobilization, social demonstrations, and street protests everywhere in Brazil, sometimes putting together 1 million people, sometimes putting together 100,000 people, sometimes a few hundred people on a daily basis since May 2003. So the question is, what has happened then to the city statute? How can we explain this gap between, these new realities of our cities and this growing unrest, social political unrest, and that promising legal framework? Has the city statute failed? Many people would say so. Others would even say that instead of promoting social-spatial integration, the city statute, especially when it allowed for the sale and development of building rights and development rights, it would have perversely contributed to the escalating process of commodification of Brazilian cities and to the further peripherization of the poor. So these are recurrent criticisms, and we do need more critical assessment to see if and how this new generation of master plans at the local level does translate the principles of the national law. We need to know what the main legal and social obstacles have been to the enforcement of the law, but above all, we need also to know if and how Brazilian society has made use of this law, if they have claimed for the new rights, if they have disputed these rights, if they have, somehow mobilized in order to get the recognition of the range of urban rights, the right to the city, which is explicitly recognized by the city statute. So is the law the real problem? So this is my question. I think it's very easy, simplistic, to blame the law, when in fact we should be asking whether planners have fully understood what the law is about. Have they made good use of the possibilities of the law? Have the lawyers understood? Have society as a whole, claimed the rights? Have the judicial system defended the new principles? So there's a range of questions that we should be addressing before we blame the law for the new realities that we see in Brazilian cities. And there are four main elements. I don't have time to discuss them, but just briefly, I think there's four general underlying questions which I think should also be noted. The first one is that most Brazilians still view the law merely as an instrument, a technical instrument, when in fact we should be discussing the law, the legal system, much more as an open-ended social-political process, a social-political arena where divergent claims dispute with each other. More than that, there is this urgent sense of, short-term solutions, and it's fully understandable because the scale of housing, sanitation, transportation problems we had accumulated over decades of neglect was such that people want it now. They want everything done now. But it's going to take a long time before we can redress this historical imbalance. More than that, also culturally, there is this enormous expectation that the state is going to do everything for everybody, instead of Brazilians mobilizing to create a truly public sphere, which is not reduced to the state order, right? We still place all our bets on the action of the states. And finally, planners, they still have a very strong sense of planning as being merely a technical, objective, neutral kind of territorial organization. They don't understand how their action is directly related to the dynamic of land and property markets. So these are underlying factors. But what has actually happened with the new generation of municipal master plans? We have studies now, empirical evidence, clearly shown that there has been progress on many, many fronts. I mean, the general discourse of urban reform has been embraced. It's widespread. More than that, specific sectors have also been dealt with. More regulations regarding environmental protection, the protection of cultural heritage, Most areas occupied by the poor, shanty towns and such like, they've been legally recognized in the master plans as special zones of social interest, thus making it easier to legalize, regularize, upgrade these areas. And more, never before did we have such a high level of popular participation in policy making in Brazil. It varies from city to city, but it can be said that this has been a very participatory process. And myself, I believe that the main merit so far has been the gigantic production of data. The fact is that until then, most municipalities in Brazil, they didn't have a clue about their own realities. They didn't have maps, photographs, numbers, and surveys, and censuses, and all that. So this in itself is also a significant achievement. But that, there are problems, legal problems, undermining these plans, excessively formalistic, bureaucratic, laws that require new laws and new laws and new laws. The planners never believed that they can act now. They always need further regulation, further regulation, further regulation. But I think that the most serious obstacle so far to the fully implementation of this law has been the fact that planners in general, they have not fully understood that there has been a conceptual change in the notion of planning promoted by the city statute. They still invest in this old-fashioned notion of planning merely as regulation, zoning and highest and best use and all that, and they failed to do what the city statute tells them to do, which is to intervene in the land structure, to force, to issue compulsory orders to determine, the actions of landowners and property owners instead of only regulation. They've been using tools without having a clearly defined project for the city, and most have failed to recapture the surplus value, such as determined by the city statute. This has happened in some places. São Paulo, for example, has been selling development rights in public auctions. Last year alone, the municipality generated over $300 million selling building rights in the city. But this doesn't mean that this gigantic amount of money has been used in such a way as to promote redistribution, right? I mean, this has led to further segregation, further peripherization, further gentrification, further increasing land prices. So the gigantic stock of vacant land, I mean, Brazil has a housing deficit of 7 million units, but we have almost 6 million vacant built properties in the country. So instead of making use of this gigantic stock of service land which is kept vacant, or even built constructions which are underutilized, the plans still refuse to confront this reality and intervene directly in the land structure. You have many other reasons, large projects such as urban renewal, urban revitalization, World Cup projects, Olympic Games, they have bypassed all that in the name of the public interest and all that. So we have a number of reasons why this new generation of master plans has not really fully translated the principles of the national law. Almost finishing here. Also, they have not taken into account the highly limited capacity to act on the local level. These are highly complex planning proposals which do not take into consideration how precarious municipalities can be, right? So money, for example, coming from the federal government has been sent back, oftentimes because of the lack of capacity to make projects, to monitor them, to implement them. So it's not a matter of deregulating. It is a matter of regulating more that which needs to be regulated, intervening in the land structure, especially so as to democratize the conditions of access to land and housing. So this is why there is this growing skepticism on the part of so many people. They see that there's a general capture of these new governmental processes by the Brazilian elites. So these are new manifestations of a long-standing process, right? And planners, they feel hostages to the market, when in fact they have created the market. They have created and fomented the London property markets in the first place, but they don't understand it. They don't understand how. So to finish, we need to consider many factors, but since we are here in the context of a school of planning, we need to rethink the way planning has been taught, the way planners have been crucial factors in determining this highly conservative, highly anachronistic approach to planning, which fails to see the link between planning and property markets and land markets. And above all, Brazilian society also needs to be more proactive in terms of disputing and claiming the recognition of the new range of rights recognized. So the law is not the problem. The law itself, is the best you can conceive. But the spaces, rights, notions created by the law have not been fully occupied, materialized, disputed at all levels. So the rules of the game have been changed, but we keep playing the game with the same old rules. And this means that the full enforcement of the legislation has been undermined. So the conclusion here is that bad laws, bad planning laws, they can be a problem in that they make it quite difficult to promote the advance of collective rights, sociospatial inclusion. But good laws per se that do not change anything. They do not automatically change urban and social realities. Even when these new good laws, progressive laws, they are more than just a declaration of intentions. They are translated, as is the rare case of the city statute, into processes, mechanisms, instruments. So it doesn't really matter if you don't use them in a proper way, which is conducive to the objectives that you have in mind. These good laws per se won't change anything. So the conclusion is sociopolitical mobilization is the answer. I think Brazilians are now finally understanding that if it took them 12 years to get this legal framework approved, now there's a new stage which has been opened with the approval of the law, which is that of the disputes for the enforcement of the law in at all governmental levels and in all forms. And the truth is that Brazil and Brazilians so far have not fully done justice. They have not fully deserved the law. The law is far better than what the social political processes have indicated us. So this is just one photograph of the countless social demonstrations in Brazil, this one in Rio. And basically, although they are about specific issues, transport, health, sanitation, corruption, and all that, they are ultimately about the right to the city, the need for us to occupy all these spaces created by this new legal paradigm to give concrete meanings to this legally recognized notion of the right to the city in Brazil. Thank you.